David Martinez had spent the last 15 years working the night shift at a manufacturing plant, a life so deeply rooted in routine. It had become second nature. Each evening, as the world wound down, David stepped into a different rhythm, one dictated by the whir of machines, the clank of metal on metal, and the sharp scent of oil and chemicals that clung to the walls like an invisible fog. The factory floor, with its flickering fluorescent lights and relentless mechanical hum, wasn't just where he worked, it was where he existed. The air inside the plant was thick and metallic, tinged with a chemical musk that most people would find unpleasant. But for David, it was background noise to the senses, just another part of the job. Even the sealed, unmarked container that sat in a shadowed corner of the facility was unremarkable to him. It had been there as long as he could remember, gathering dust. Never opened. Never moved. It was as much a fixture as the machines themselves. But then came the morning that changed everything. As David was washing his hands after another long shift, he noticed something unusual, a tiny blister forming on the side of his right index finger. It was clear, round, and unusually defined. At first, he dismissed it. In his line of work, minor injuries were routine. His hands bore the evidence. Calluses, cuts, faded burn marks, all the signatures of a life spent handling raw metal, industrial solvents, and heavy machinery. A blister, he figured, was just another byproduct of the job. Still, something about this one felt off. It wasn't just its clarity or shape. The blister almost looked artificial, like a perfectly formed droplet of water sealed beneath the skin. It didn't throb or ache the way most injuries did, just a faint, pulsing sting when pressed, like it was resisting him. There was no redness, no surrounding irritation, just that strange, glassy dome where there hadn't been one the day before. David stared at it for a long moment, then shrugged it off. He had a family to support, a job to do, and no time to fuss over something so small. He dried his hands, threw on his jacket, and headed home, unaware that the mysterious blemish on his finger was just the beginning of something far more dangerous. David was 36. And had worked nearly half his life at Martinez Manufacturing. Night after night, he moved through the familiar rhythm of his shift, clocking in at sunset, changing into his grease-stained uniform, and making his rounds on the factory floor. He was one of the most reliable employees, dependable, hardworking, and never one to complain, no matter the overtime or physical strain. He was a man of routine, and disruption was not something he welcomed easily. His role required constant physical contact with industrial machinery and cleaning chemicals. He operated hydraulic presses, managed metal molding processes, and cleaned heavy components with solvents designed to strip away hardened grime. His gloves offered basic protection, but prolonged exposure to such substances was inevitable. Even so, he had never experienced a reaction like this before. The blister didn't fade. Instead, it grew. Within a few days, another identical bump appeared on his left hand. Then a third, on the base of his thumb. They were eerily consistent, circular, smooth, filled with a shimmering fluid that seemed to shift slightly with motion. He found himself distracted during his shift, staring at his hands between tasks. His fingers felt tight. The skin stretched around the swelling blisters, which were now starting to ache slightly under pressure. Still, David kept going. The factory never stopped, not for blisters. Not for fatigue. The night shift was the backbone of the operation, responsible for the dirtiest and most labor-intensive jobs. Deep cleaning machinery, moving heavy molds, and preparing the assembly line for the morning shift. David worked alongside a small, tight-knit team, most of whom had been with the company just as long. Like him, they were creatures of habit, immune to discomfort, and accustomed to pushing through the wear and tear. At home, however, David's discomfort became more difficult to hide. His wife, Maria, noticed immediately. During dinner, she would catch him absent-mindedly flexing his fingers, inspecting them under the kitchen light, his fork untouched. When he finally showed her his hands, she recoiled in shock. The blisters were no longer just abnormalities, they looked almost unnatural. Beneath the translucent skin, the fluid shimmered with a life of its own, swirling slowly, as if responding to movement. Maria had never seen anything like it. Fear began to gnaw at her, and she insisted that David see a doctor immediately. Reluctantly, he agreed. The physician, Dr. Sarah Chen, had practiced medicine in the community for over 20 years. But even she was stunned when David removed his gloves. She examined the blisters closely, noting their symmetry, the fluid's viscosity, and, most disturbingly, the faint, undulating motion within each one. Initially suspecting a rare allergic reaction or chemical exposure, Dr. Chen took fluid samples and sent them to the state lab for urgent analysis. In the meantime, she prescribed antibiotics and anti-inflammatory medications, hoping to reduce the swelling and prevent infection. But the condition only worsened. Over the next few days, the blisters spread, now coating David's palms and fingertips. The clear fluid began to seep through his skin, soaking his gloves in a sticky residue with a sharp chemical odor. His ability to handle tools diminished rapidly. He had to change gloves several times during a single shift to avoid contaminating equipment or leaving residue on the metal parts. His co-workers began to notice, casting nervous glances as he worked. Though no one said anything outright, David tried to act like nothing had changed. But inside, he was beginning to fear the worst. His hands, his livelihood, were failing him. And somewhere deep inside, he sensed this was only the beginning. David's productivity began to falter. His movements slowed. His grip weakened. And tasks that once took minutes now required careful, deliberate effort. His foreman noticed the decline but chalked it up to a common case of workplace dermatitis, a routine skin irritation caused by constant contact with harsh substances. In the world of industrial labor, such issues were expected. Workers were exposed daily to powerful degreasers, rust removers, and chemical adhesives. Though protective equipment was supplied, gloves, goggles, heavy-duty aprons, most veteran workers, including David, had long grown used to cutting corners. The gear often felt cumbersome. And after years of working without major incident, safety protocols had become more ritual than requirement. But this was different. The blisters that plagued David's hands were not typical irritations, they were something far more insidious. When they began to interfere with even the simplest tasks, Maria's concern turned urgent. She insisted David see a doctor again, this time demanding answers. By now, gripping tools had become nearly impossible for him. Every time pressure was applied to his fingers, the blisters would rupture, releasing a sticky, chemical-smelling fluid that clung stubbornly to his skin. Maria feared an infection. Or worse, something systemic. David returned to Dr. Sarah Chen's clinic, a seasoned physician who had served the local community for more than 20 years. She had seen her fair share of workplace injuries, but nothing prepared her for the sight of David's hands when he removed his gloves. They were covered in dozens of bulbous, symmetrical blisters. Each one shimmered with an internal movement that caught the light in strange, almost mesmerizing ways. Dr. Chen examined them with a magnifying lens. The clear fluid inside each blister wasn't inert, it shifted subtly, as though responding to movement or temperature. It reminded her less of a skin reaction and more of something biological, something alive. Though puzzled, she initially leaned toward an allergic response to chemical exposure, not uncommon in factory workers with prolonged contact to harsh materials. She prescribed antibiotics and a powerful anti-inflammatory, hoping to reduce swelling and prevent secondary infection, and scheduled a follow-up for the following week. David returned to work while waiting for the medication to take effect. The night shift at Martinez Manufacturing rolled on, unchanged and unbothered. The machinery clanged and rumbled through the darkness. Shelves were restocked with drums of industrial-grade cleaners. The air was thick with the familiar cocktail of metal dust and chemical fumes. Everything on the surface seemed routine, but the medication offered no relief. Days later, the blisters had grown alarmingly. Some were now the size of marbles. The skin around them stretched tight and translucent. The fluid inside had become thicker, more opaque, with subtle swirling motions that seemed to pulse in sync with his heartbeat. Handling parts became painful, and the risk of contaminating machinery with his leaking gloves became a constant concern. David's duties placed him in direct contact with industrial-strength cleaning agents, caustic chemicals designed to strip layers of grease, oil, and corrosion from metal components in seconds. These substances were effective but aggressive, and the long-term consequences of exposure were rarely discussed. Realizing that David's condition was progressing in an unprecedented and alarming way, Dr. Chen decided to escalate. During his next visit, she carefully extracted a fluid sample from one of the largest blisters. The process was delicate, one puncture with a fine sterile needle, and a thick, oily liquid emerged. It carried a faint, acrid odor, sharp enough to sting her nose. Disturbed by the sample's strange composition, she immediately packaged it and sent it to the state health department's laboratory, marking the case as urgent and requesting expedited analysis. Back at the factory, David continued working under increasing strain. His hands were constantly soaked despite multiple layers of gloves. His coworkers began to whisper among themselves, exchanging uneasy glances as they noticed the swelling, the stains, and the faint chemical odor that now clung to David like a second skin. But David remained silent. The factory, after all, had passed every inspection. The company held all the appropriate certifications. On paper, everything was compliant. 3 days later, Dr. Chen's phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to a state lab technician. It was tight, urgent, shaken. The results were unlike anything the lab had seen in recent years. The fluid inside David's blisters tested positive for hexachlorocyclohexane, a potent, long-band industrial chemical. The compound had been outlawed over 3 decades earlier due to its extreme toxicity, environmental persistence, and its classification as a carcinogen. Even minimal exposure could lead to lasting damage, neurological disorders, immune system disruption, organ failure. Dr. Chen hung up the phone and immediately called the Department of Health. This wasn't just a medical anomaly anymore, it was a public health emergency. Dr. Chen wasted no time. As soon as the lab results came in, she contacted the Department of Health with a sense of urgency she had rarely felt in her 2-decade career. The presence of hexachlorocyclohexane in David Martinez's bloodstream, a chemical banned for over 30 years, was not just a medical crisis. It was a public safety emergency. Within hours, law enforcement was brought in. Detective Rebecca Walsh, a seasoned investigator with a background in environmental crime, arrived at Dr. Chen's clinic to begin a formal inquiry. Calm but resolute, she asked detailed questions about David's symptoms, his work history, and the nature of his exposure. The pieces began to form a disturbing puzzle. The investigation quickly led back to Martinez Manufacturing. What had seemed like an isolated health case soon revealed a decades-long pattern of illegal activity. Environmental specialists conducted a thorough inspection of the facility, collecting soil, air, and water samples from both inside and around the factory site. What they discovered was shocking. For years, the company had been bypassing hazardous waste disposal regulations. Instead of paying for proper chemical waste treatment, the factory's owner had opted for a dangerous and illegal shortcut, mixing expired, toxic compounds, including hexachlorocyclohexane, into the industrial cleaning solutions used daily by workers on the floor. It was a calculated, cost-cutting scheme masked under the guise of routine operations. No one suspected a thing. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community. Martinez Manufacturing had been a major local employer, trusted, even respected. The idea that workers like David had unknowingly handled toxic substances, night after night, was met with outrage and disbelief. Authorities acted swiftly. The factory was shut down indefinitely, its operations halted by an emergency order. The owner was arrested and faced a slew of charges: criminal negligence, reckless endangerment, illegal chemical disposal, and violations of federal environmental laws. Prosecutors began building a high-profile case, determined to hold him accountable for the damage inflicted on his employees and the environment. As for David, his ordeal was far from over. He began an intensive recovery process that would take months. The treatment included medical detoxification, specialized dermatological care, and physical therapy to restore function in his damaged hands. Though his health gradually improved, the scars, both physical and emotional, remained. More than just a personal tragedy, David's case became a public symbol of the invisible risks workers face every day. It forced regulators, lawmakers, and the public to confront a grim truth: that safety procedures mean nothing when profits are prioritized over people. The Martinez case sparked renewed calls for stricter inspections, harsher penalties for corporate wrongdoing, and increased transparency in hazardous material handling. Investigations into other facilities across the region followed, uncovering additional violations. David never asked to be the face of a scandal, but his story became a catalyst for change. So now, the question falls to you. If strange symptoms appeared in your workplace, would you accept the status quo and trust that everything is safe? Or would you speak up, ask questions, and demand the truth before it's too late?